Merry Christmas and welcome back to Against Modernism. I'm Daniel. Today I wanted to talk about liberalism and basically how it went from a religious and a philosophical idea and it turned into a moral and a political crisis, and that's the crisis that we're seeing today in our societies. So I wanted to show you the connection between the philosophy of it and the problems with the modern world. I speak to a lot of my friends and a lot of other people about this, and they have trouble understanding the importance of rethinking their philosophical ideals because they don't think that philosophy really has an impact on things like morality, which is, I don't know how you can think that, politics, and even things like science. Philosophy has a huge impact on all of these. All of these other kind of schools of thought they rely on philosophical presuppositions. So today I wanted to show you how liberalism provides the false presuppositions that fuels these modern political, scientific, and moral ethical movements. And I'm going to be drawing a lot of this episode from the Holy Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who is a true champion of tradition. I'm reading his book right now. They have uncrowned him. If you're Catholic and you're interested in these kind of ideas, I highly recommend that book. But I'd like to begin with a G.K. Chesterton quote, actually, that basically sums up the lack of difference between the libs and the conservatards. And he says, "The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Even when the revolutionist might himself repent of his revolution, the traditionalist is already defending it as part of his tradition. Thus, we have two great types, the advanced person who rushes us into ruin, and the retrospective person who admires the ruins." And that's the end of the quote. This is so obviously true when we look around today, right? Conservatives are now, what are they doing? They're sporting the gay pride flags. They're pro-abortion. There's no such thing as social conservatism. They're probably already booking their gender reassignment surgeries as we speak. Are these really the quote-unquote new traditionalists that we are supposed to rely on to return order to our nations? The trannies, the gays, the godless atheists that call themselves conservative? No. The question I'm interested in, though, is how did we get to this point? And more specifically, what does the philosophical tradition of liberalism look like in its modern form? Because we all know that in order to prevent a weed from growing back, we need to pull it out right from the roots. And the roots of this weed are deep, and the name of this weed is liberalism. So the big question is, what is liberalism? And there's a fantastic quote in the book that I mentioned earlier by Archbishop Lefebvre. And this quote is actually from Father Marcel, who wrote a book in the 1920s on the subject. And he says this: "The liberal is a fanatic for independence. He extols it to the point of absurdity in every domain." And the rest of this kind of essay, this episode, is going to talk about what domains that the liberal has pushed his insane quest or crusade for independence. What domains has he pushed it in, and what does that look like? So let's reflect on that for a minute. The liberal is a fanatic for independence. Well, this is pretty obvious too. Look around. Look how far the LMNOP, the you-know-what movement has digressed into absurdity. You'll have a woman that attempted to change themselves into a man with hormone therapy, and they're breastfeeding a baby with their hairy chest, and that baby apparently came out of this quote-unquote man's you-know-what. So, absolutely absurd, and this is the peak of liberalism that we see today. And I want to show you the basic assumptions of the liberal philosophy and kind of connect them to the modern thought, the modern morality, the modern philosophy. This is just a great example of the absolute absurdity, but I'm going to go back and connect all the steps because it seems like a far cry to kind of go from, well, Descartes said this, and then you have a man who's a woman. So I'm going to kind of connect some dots in the middle there. And if I were to actually do this subject any justice, this video would probably be like 12 hours long. So I'm going to cover just the basics here, and I'm going to get into more detailed analysis maybe in some further videos on the specifics. But I wanted to do a brief outline this time. So in order to do this, I want to explore the kind of domains that have already been taken over and or infected is probably a better word, by liberalism. And I'm going to start with the philosophical departure from tradition. So we're going to call this first domain of liberalism epistemology. And when we're speaking about epistemology, we're really asking, how can the truth be known? Or how can we as individuals know the truth? And the liberal basically believes that the truth is subjective. It's all about the individual. It's all inside their own brain. Okay? It's all inside their own mind. He separates the mind and the body, and therefore he sacrifices the ability to really know external objects. So to give you an idea about this, like how this would be applied in reality, when we see things as traditionalists, what do we see? Well, I look at a dog walking on the sidewalk, and I can easily distinguish between the dog and the sidewalk. They're two distinct beings with their own essences, right? I can acknowledge the dog is a living being. I can acknowledge the sidewalk is some type of composition formed by man. And I easily just know that just by looking at them. But the liberal epistemologian would reject this idea. They would put some type of like mental barrier between the thing itself and the knowing of the thing. So basically they say our mind is not connected to our body. Like we don't know how that connection works, so we can't really trust what our body is telling our mind. That's the essence of it. And this basically leads to two ideas that really characterize modern liberal philosophy. And that is, one, subjectivism, and two, evolution. Okay? So first, I'm going to go into subjectivism, and we'll explore evolution after, and I'm going to try and tie these things into the actual modern instantiations of these ideas. So first, subjectivism is the liberation, the freeing of the intellect from those pesky constraints. So things that are holding it down, and those things are objective reality. So basically, the tradition says that we see things. I see a dog, and that dog is actually informing my intellect about what it is. So it's a real thing. I'm experiencing it as accurately as possible, and it's basically forming my intellect into it's informing my intellect with its own kind of essence or form. That's forcing my intellect to recognize what it is. So we have this outside or external objective truth that informs our mind. And liberals basically see this as something that is constraining them, or they see it as a being almost enslaved to reality. And that's really what it is. So all reality becomes subjective to these people because, according to the liberal philosophers, that dog that we can clearly see actually only exists within our mind, because that's the way that they go about freeing themselves from the chains, if you will, of objective reality. So this is seen as the liberation because the intellect is no longer a slave to the objective reality that it interacts with. If the mind and body are separate, then we're free to believe whatever we want about the nature of reality. And I just told you the traditional belief, there's no barrier between our senses and our intellect because they're united through the kind of hylomorphic composition. That means that our body is the our soul is the act of our body. And I discussed this in previous episodes, and I'll link those in the video. But our intellect really is our soul, and our soul is contained in every part of our body. So our body experiences reality as it really is. And our intellect is conformed to real objects in the world, and the fidelity, the accuracy of this conformity, we call that like knowing, or we understand that's how we gain knowledge, and that's how we know external truths. Okay. If you want to look more into this liberal phenomenon in philosophical history, it's referred to as idealism, and it's held by many famous modern philosophers of the modernist philosophical tradition. But let's move away from philosophers for a second and look at the moral, the social, the political, and even the kind of religious consequences of this ideological movement. So I think it's good to look at and Archbishop Lefebvre outlines this in his book, but he basically says, look at the subjectivist forces throughout history, the big ones, and what did they kind of contribute to this liberal movement. The first of these forces is Martin Luther. He's the first big one, and he's probably the most influential overall. Why? Because he rejected the truths of the faith held within the magisterium, the teaching magisterium of the church. Basically, he said, the church has no authority over truth. Only I, the individual, have the authority. And so you see this throughout Protestant tradition. Protestantism has featured this kind of individualistic approach to faith ever since Luther. And they have abandoned all the objective truths of the faith by embracing the subjectivity, this idea that the faith is subjective, and the church has no authority on the faith. Only I am. I read the Bible on my own, and I decide what it means to me. Okay. Next, in these subjective giants throughout history is Descartes and the rest of the idealists, especially Kant. These are philosophers. Their contribution was philosophical. They provided a legitimacy to this idea. They provided a real rational argument. They made this individual subjectivism into something kind of resembling objectivity, but only within the individual human mind. Okay, so they kind of trick you into this idea that, no, it is objective, but only my mind can know it. So it's really kind of a subjective objectivity. They're kind of twisting these things, right? Rather than an external objectivity, which the traditionalists believe in. What they really did by doing this is they gave a legitimacy to this idea of subjectivity by providing a rational system for it, for understanding it. For instance, Descartes says that the only truth that we can really know, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Because what he does is he says, well, I am doubting my senses. I don't know if my body and mind are detached from each other. So my senses, how can I trust that they're portraying an accurate description of reality to my mind? So he basically says, what are the things that I can know without reference to my senses or without reference to my experiences, since the mind and body are separate? And he says, the only thing I can really know is that I think, and therefore I am. And in doing this, he sets the new foundation for the ability to know external realities. He sets the new foundation as, no, I can't actually know external realities. The only reality I can know is that I exist. So he kind of encloses the intellect into a box by itself, where the senses and experiences of the individual can't touch. So you can't actually receive information from the outside that you can count on and that you can develop your kind of common sense worldview from. You have to start not with external truth, but with internal truth. So he flips that switch. And that's really the switch that defines all of the liberals. Okay. And Kant, in the same tradition, he attempts to kind of develop a moral law without any reference to externals. So it's almost like he's replacing the 10 Commandments, but he's replacing them only with rational truths created by the human mind. Okay. And by systematizing or creating a rational argument for these ideas, they therefore give them this kind of legitimacy, this rational legitimacy, where there's some type of argument for them in the minds of their followers. So Descartes and Kant have been very influential in the spreading popularity of subjectivism, and this kind of extends throughout the tradition. It extends further, and it will begin to evolve into other modernist and postmodernist philosophies that are based on the same flipping that switch inside from external reality to internal reality. And later on, we'll see these ideas begin to infiltrate the church and ultimately society as well. And finally, in this kind of giants of subjectivism that we're talking about historically, we have Rousseau. And Rousseau inherited this idea of that internal that flip being switched, that switch being flipped. Sorry, so it flips from external reality to internal reality. That's what Descartes did. So Rousseau takes this and he says, we no longer have common sense because common sense is based on an understanding of reality as external to us. So, since no sense can be made of anything when the intellect is separated from real objects, because of this, Rousseau and his followers basically insist that the thoughts of individuals, since they have no reference to common sense, so like if you had two people in an argument, the common sense thing to do would be like, hey, I'm pointing this out. It's obviously true. Like, look over there. There's that dog has 4 legs, not 3, right? But since we've abandoned that connection with our senses, we can no longer point to external truths as a argument for a common sense, for a way to individuals to resolve their arguments, right? So what Rousseau says, basically what begins to happen is that individuals begin to align their thoughts and ideas with whatever the majority thinks, because you no longer have this external truth to refer to solve these common sense arguments. So what do you start to do? You start to just agree with what everyone else thinks, because common sense doesn't exist, external reality doesn't exist, right? So once we abandon the common sense, our minds are basically lost at sea. I kind of like this analogy of your mind being a ship at sea. We'll basically fall, and when you're lost at sea, let's say you're lost in a fog in a ship, what are you going to do to try to find your way home, right? Well, if there's no lighthouse, you're going by your other senses, so you're listening. And what happens? Well, you hear these people crying out from other ships that are also lost at sea. So you go and you kind of join together, and no one is looking for the lighthouse, no one is actually looking for the shore. What ends up happening in Rousseau's idea is that they're kind of all finding each other, and they're becoming lost together at sea, right? So there is no actual shore, and there's no lighthouse to look to, according to Rousseau. So the best we can do is basically follow each other around in circles on this stormy sea, in this deep fog. But then the question is basically, who leads this new convoy of ships? They're lost, they're traveling in circles, but who's leading? Because in order for the ships to congregate, there has to be a leader. And basically what that comes down to, what that looks like in the modern instantiation of liberalism, is that it's the media, it's the politicians, it's the bankers, it's the Freemasons, it's the tribe. And these people are the thought leaders. These people are the ones who are controlling the majority opinion. They're the ones putting out the newspapers. They're the ones providing us money, shutting down accounts for people who speak truth, right? So When we abandon common sense, when we abandon God, and when we abandon traditional metaphysics, and we lose our grasp on reality, we make ourselves the willing slaves of these thought leaders, these bankers, these tribesmen, the media, the corrupt politicians, right? These ships at the front of the procession, leading us in circles to our inevitable deaths, because what else is there if you don't get back to shore? This is true slavery, and it all comes from that initial philosophical idea of the individual intellect being freed from the constraints of objective reality. So if you believe in these ideas, if you believe in liberalism, if you believe that the reality is actually subjective, it's the individual who experiences it, or in any kind of evolution of these ideas. So even if you haven't thought about any of this, but your opinions are conforming to the people who do believe these things, to the media, to the politicians, to the status quo, the modern status quo, you are being controlled. You are a slave. Freedom, true freedom, is found in tradition, in reality, in common sense, and in the faith, and at the most basic level, it is found in the Catholic Church. Okay? So we covered subjectivism and where it leads. It leads you to being lost at sea. It leads you to being led around by the media, led around by these politicians. Next, I want to briefly talk about the idea of evolution. So what is evolution? Evolution is a liberal idea that opposes the traditional metaphysical worldview. So, quick note, when I'm speaking of evolution, because I know a lot of you guys are going to be like, oh, this guy's an evolution denier, he's a science denier. No. I'm not talking about the observable changes to an organism over time that basically adapts it to a changing environment, which is the obvious understanding of evolution. You can't really deny that happens, right? I'm talking about the presuppositions made by the evolutionists. You see, just because we may be able to observe these slight variations in organisms over time, we can't use that to infer that an organism has evolved from an individual cell over billions and billions of years. And we can't even claim that a monkey will have the capabilities of a man in another billion years. We can't claim either of those things. Those are both inferences. Those are both religious claims. They end up being a religious claim that speaks to the creation of life, right? And the creation of the universe, etc. Because when you're inferring that an observable phenomenon must point to these other observable phenomenons, well, that's a religious claim. That's the same thing that we're saying in traditional metaphysics, where we say that the nature of a thing is inherently built into it and designed into it. It's the same claim. It's obviously they're opposing each other, but it's the same. They both have the same foundation of belief. They're not scientifically proven. Both of them have science kind of backing them up in their own ways, but you're choosing to believe that. That's an inference that's made that presupposes the science. Okay, so when we say evolution is opposed to tradition, we're not speaking about observable scientific facts. Instead, we're speaking about theories that really are these kind of wild and overreaching the boundaries of our understanding. They're pointing to claims that are faith-based, not science-based. So the main problem with the concept of evolution is that it abandons the traditional metaphysical understanding of the essence of beings. So the Catholic, a well-informed Catholic, understands that a thing's essence is immutable or unchangeable. It's unable to change. Any changes that occur in a being or even a species over time are already contained in that essence of that particular being, and they're simply being fulfilled over a period of time. So for instance, to give you an idea of what I'm saying here, you could say that an acorn, quote unquote, evolves into a giant oak tree over a period of 1,000 years. But really, what's happening is that acorn is just fulfilling the natural perfection of its own essence. It is built within it to become an oak tree. And we can see it, yes, we see it growing over time, right? But that doesn't mean that it's evolving. That just means that it's fulfilling its essence. So the same can be true of these observable evolutionary changes that we witness in different species. For instance, the skin color and bone structure of humans, they might be able to adapt to different climates and different environments over time. So, like black people and meds, they have darker skin because their climate has more sun, and something to do with white people being hurt by the sun, so they adapt. Their skin darkens over time, right? But this adaptation is basically already accounted for in their essence. So in the essence of humanity, in our species, is built in that ability to adapt towards a specific end, right? So you don't have to view it as a random mutation caused from kind of this interaction of material with other material. You can view it as, which is basically what the evolutionists claim, right? They claim that because atoms basically smash against each other randomly, it has developed this kind of underlying structure where, like, it really breaks down when you think about it, when you think about evolution, right? Because they're basically saying that we all, like modern humanity, modern animals, modern like nature as we know it, has evolved randomly. It has all been a random mutation in order to let that specific species or whatever they're focusing on survive. But what they're really saying is that it's the same thing as that we're claiming here, is that there seems to be an underlying or a presupposition that is built into us to adapt to new environments, right? But they never get to that point, because modern science and these modern evolutionist types, they don't care. They only look at what is materially observable. But then they try to make these wild claims about the nature of things and the where things first came from, and they end up being religious claims, right? They try to disprove the claims of the Catholic faith about the nature of man and the origin of man through these inferences made by material observations. But the problem is that those material observations can be interpreted through our traditional metaphysics as well, right? So really what they're saying is, we deny the metaphysics, we deny your religious claims. That's it. It's purely religious and has nothing to do with science. And I'll probably do another episode entirely on evolution, just because there's so much to dedicate to that. And there's been some great thinkers and Catholic writers that have done a ton of work on that. And it kind of deserves its own episode, but I'll just keep moving on here. Let's think about what we need to sacrifice if we give up our traditional understanding in favor of this new evolutionary theory. We're basically saying, if we accept this, that man has no immutable essence. So he has no unchanging essence. And therefore, he's vastly different than he was 2,000 years ago when Christ offered himself on the cross for our salvation. So, according to the evolutionist, perhaps we no longer need salvation. Perhaps the moral laws that governed us 2,000 years ago no longer apply to us, because man today is so different to the man of yesterday, right? If we're constantly evolving. But the problem with this is that the liberal dogmatist, they want to say that their new morality is objective and that everyone should obey their new commandments. For instance, thou shalt say Black Lives Matter. Thou shalt not talk about the Holocaust. Thou shalt not be xenophobic. Thou shalt not be proud of their tradition, their religion, etc., right? They want us to obey these commandments, but if we adopt if we give them a mirror and we say, okay, we're going to use your own understanding of evolution and apply it to why should we accept any of these moral commandments that you're giving us. If the man of yesterday is so different to the man of today that we have to abandon our tradition, right? Because that's their claim. They're saying modern man is completely different than traditional man. We are more complex. We're more evolved. We're more civilized, right? So they say because of that, we need to abandon our old way of thinking and go with these new ways. We need to accept gay people. We need to accept trans. We need to accept all this stuff. So, but the problem with this is, who is to say that the man of tomorrow should obey the new liberal traditions? Because it's the same argument that can be used against them. So if we throw away the immutable character of the essence of man, then we can never develop an objective morality. And this idea of evolution walks hand in hand with the liberal philosophers' conclusions about our inability to access reality with our intellect, right? Nietzsche probably said it the best. He said, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." And that's really a perfect description of this new liberal philosophical movement. I've kind of shown you how this idea of subjectivity and this idea of evolution, they both work together to create an environment where you can never make an objective claim about reality or about morality or anything, okay? And so it is absolutely necessary that if we are to make any real progress as traditionalists, we must reclaim the objective truth. And this should be our primary goal, okay? Our primary goal should not be setting up a fascist government. Our primary goal should not be, physically harming these people. Before that, we must make sure that everyone in our movement understands what we are actually trying to achieve. And what we're trying to achieve is a return to the truth, and that must be the thing that guides us in our counter-revolutionary movement, okay? So what does that look like? Well, we must deny the liberal philosophers' skepticism and their denial of reality. Remember Kant and Descartes? Deny them. Deny that whole tradition. We must deny the liberal politicians' insistence on conformity to the will of the majority through a denial of common sense, okay? Reject everything, every law that is being passed in your country that is against common sense, that is against the our philosophical tradition, our religion, Catholicism. Deny, fight them, okay? We must deny the false claims of the evolutionists that the nature of things is ever changing, as opposed to the traditional understanding that the essences of things are eternal and designed with a purpose. Stress purpose. When you're teaching your kids, teach them the correct philosophy. Do not meet the liberals halfway, okay? Things are designed with a purpose. They are not constantly changing. They have a distinct essence, and any change in that being can be accounted for within its eternal essence, okay? And this is why I always hammer the importance of understanding the essence of things as eternal, as designed towards fulfilling a purpose. But most of all, we looked at the philosophy, we looked at the political side, we looked at the moral claims, right? But most of all, we need to go back to the very roots of this crisis. And we need to reject the liberal religious errors of Martin Luther. What does that mean? It means we must embrace the magisterium of the Catholic Church, who is solely responsible for the greatness of Europe, who perfected philosophy, and who has the only claim to the salvation of our souls, which we know to be our eternal essences, right? They're eternal. The goal of the modernists is to sink your ship. Remember that ship? They're going to sink you. And where are you going to go? You're going to go right into hell. After sailing in circles for your entire life, you have no meaning. You have a subjective understanding of reality. You have no grasp of anything. You feel lost. That's because you have a terrible philosophy. That's because you've adopted the liberal consequences of their philosophical, religious, political, etc. All of their traditions, you've accepted them. You're sailing blind in the middle of the ocean, and you're going to go to hell. You're going to go to hell if you believe these things. So instead, what do we have to do? We have to break away from this doomed and slavish procession of these ships. You have to break away, and you have to look, because there is the light, there's the lighthouse, and there's the shore, and that's the tradition and the Catholic faith. Okay, so if you have these ideas left inside you, if you're trying to meet them halfway, you have to reject everything, okay? You have to reject it all, and you have to return completely to the tradition and to the faith. So is that everything? What about liberalism and modern laws? Well, the laws that are creeping ever so steadily towards they're going towards complete lunacy. They're insane, right? In Canada, it's so bad. It is legal to have abortions, right? And it's illegal to insist that your infant son is a biological male. They will literally take away your child if let's say you send them to preschool and they're playing with let's say your son is playing with a doll. The teacher will say, "Oh, Timmy, do you think you're a woman?" And sure, Timmy's just going to go along with it. And guess what? Now you have Child Protective Services knocking on your door, making sure that you're complying with his wish to be a woman, right? That was communicated by this teacher. This is insane. This is madness. But this law, it came about because of liberalism. The liberal believes, remember, that laws impose constraints on them. And so their intent is to change laws to be separated from morality, because morality ultimately constrains them from pursuing certain courses of action that are evil. So eventually this results in laws enforcing immorality, like we see with like the above example, and also making the moral action illegal, which is protecting your son from this modernist confusion, this modernist idiocy, this complete delusional thought of gender. To preserve your son from that is just and right, and that is becoming illegal. And this is a natural consequence. The modern liberal confuses liberty with license. They want the law to give them the license to commit immoral acts like abortion, rather than the liberty to act towards the good, because liberty ultimately is something that pursues the good. So you're not liberated. You don't have the liberty to pursue evil. You're given the license by our governments, but liberty is always aimed towards the objective good. The traditionalist recognizes that all laws descend from divine law. They are given to us by our Lord Jesus Christ in mainly two ways. One is through the inferences of natural law, through the contact of our intellect with nature. So we can see how things are designed, and we can make inferences based on that as to the nature of certain things like sex, right? And they're also given to us through the commandments of divine revelation, which we inherit through the magisterium of the church. Right, Luther? Right? So we're supposed to inherit these things. Okay, what about liberalism in the media? Liberalism is the new religion of slogans that rely on emotion and toss out reason. So what kind of media do we get? Well, we get media that says we're against violence, but we're in favor of child sacrifice, right? The A word. We're against superstition, but we're pro-atheism. We're pro-religious inferences that are inherently anti-Catholic. We are against racism, but we're also for eugenics programs. We're for these Planned Parenthood type programs that are inherently racist in their results, right? They love using these slogans, despite the obvious contradictions, because they have rhetorical power in their appeal to our emotions. And women are so easily fooled by these things, right? And lots of men too. They conjure up these images that they've been ingrained in us in the modern education systems as terrible images, as abhorrent, as things to be disgusted by. For instance, they would condemn nations like Italy and Spain for fighting to preserve the faith from these atheist communist types, they would condemn the Spanish and the Italian as evil fascists. And at the same time, they would make themselves out, themselves I'm referring to are the communists, are the atheists, are the liberals. They would make themselves out to be the apostles of peace, of liberty, of tolerance, and of pluralism, as Archbishop Lefebvre puts so perfectly in his book. And another point, what about liberalism and sexuality? Well, like everything else, they reverse it. They reverse the good and the evil. So the traditional understanding of sexuality is that its primary end is for procreation within marriage. What do we have now? The primary end of sexuality, according to the liberal, is the carnal pleasure of the act. And now they'll even go so far to say that the carnal pleasure is the only good that can come of sex itself, because as we know, procreation, especially if you're white, European, American, Canadian, is wrong. It's a sin because climate change, etc. And this is all because they have no concept of divine law, natural law. They have no concept of purpose. And so all these moral constraints, which adhere to a natural order, they're thrown out the window in favor of individual pleasure or preference. So this all still ties into that initial idea of isolating the individual from reality and making it all about the individual's mind and the individual's decisions rather than the adherence to an objective truth, right? Well, ultimately, now that we've looked at all these points, the largest problem of liberalism, which all these other areas point to, is that the liberal thinks himself independent to the rest of society. They think of themselves as an individual rather than having a duty to their society, right? There's no hierarchy. There's no authority. There's only the individual. But once you adopt this idea, there's no stopping at the deposition of a king or a tyrant. You must also depose the church. You must depose the bishop. You must depose the priest. You must depose the governor. You must depose the mayor. You must depose the sheriff. And you must depose ultimately, and this is their main goal, you must depose the father of the family. And we're seeing this manifest currently. Look at any anti-patriarchy movement that's popular today. There's tons of them, and it's massively popular. Feminism is the big one. It's been happening for the past century. Antifa, BLM, all of these institutions seek to dethrone the father. They would love to cut the head off of the traditional family. So we cannot deny the authority of God, because if we do, we will naturally end up denying the authority of the father. After all, why should children obey their father if truth is subjective? Right? The undermining of truth and the undermining of authority go hand in hand. So the truth, as our tradition teaches, is that all of our rights as individuals come with accompanying duties. So we have a duty to the higher authorities. We have a duty to our fathers. We have to respect and obey them, right? And this extends also to the higher authorities. We have a duty to our society and to our nation and to our priest, of course, and our bishop. But our highest duty is towards God. Liberalism throws away duties because it throws away all moral constraints, right? That's the heart of liberalism. I want to be free of any responsibility. That's the heart of the entire movement, of the entire philosophy. That was Luther, that was Descartes, that was Kant, that was Rousseau, that was all of these guys. Every liberal, every modernist, at the heart of their philosophy is, I do not want to be held responsible. I do not want duty. So they throw away the duties because it throws away moral constraints, because they throw away objective reality, and with it, they throw away the magisterial teaching authority of the church. So we've forgotten this. We've forgotten that we have rights we have duties to a higher authority, and instead we try to preserve rights by themselves. But these rights don't really exist unless we acknowledge the hierarchical authority structure, as we have seen. Right? You don't have rights if there's no God. And this is the trick they've been trying to play. They've been trying to keep the rights and do away with the duty towards God. And it doesn't work. The church teaches that society is not just a shapeless mass of individuals. It's an organized organism. It has hierarchies. They're naturally built in there. The family is the most basic one, right? The organization of labor, the trades and all types of laborers, farmers, etc. Then there's also the state. These things are natural hierarchies. So the traditional understanding of classes, and I'll get more into this in later episodes as well, was that they all work together. All these classes, these different classes in a hierarchical structure, they work together to achieve what? To achieve a common good. And this common good only exists if you have an understanding of reality as objective. It only exists if you can point to things and say, that is the common understanding that we have together. We're trying to resolve a conflict. Remember, Rousseau denies that? Well, that's the basis of the common good too. You have to be able to point to reality to have a common good. And our common good is dictated by the moral teachings of the church, right? That historically has been the best way to unite a society, is to say the church says this and this and this, and it all makes sense because we believe in this, and here's the philosophy that proves it, and we can point to it when we have conflicts. But today, what do we have? Well, because of the infiltration of Marxist and liberal ideas, we view the classes as existing in opposition to one another. And this is all made possible by the fact that we have thrown away our idea of the common good, right? We can't have a common good because we don't have anything more than the individual mind. We've thrown out God and the church with Martin Luther. We've thrown out objective reality and natural order with Descartes and Kant. We've thrown out objective morality and common sense with Rousseau. And we have thrown out the family and modern society with the denial of this natural order and hierarchy that has been at the heart of the liberal philosophy, because they want to free themselves, right? So this has been a long episode. Let's end it here. I think I made it pretty clear how liberalism has really been the root cause of this kind of disgusting, decrepit, grotesque tree or weed that is modern society and modern religion and modern morality and modern philosophy. We need to cut it all out at the roots. And to do that, we must reject the entirety of the liberal and modernist tradition, starting with Luther, right? He's at the heart of it. He's the first one to embrace that rejection of responsibility, that rejection of duty, that rejection of reality. So we must embrace the eternal teachings of the magisterium of the Church of Jesus Christ, and that is the Catholic Church. We must embrace traditional philosophy and acknowledge that we are in fact living souls made in the image of God who truly and accurately experience reality, an external reality. And we must reclaim the traditional morality which relies on the church and on the traditional philosophy. Liberalism has gone much too far, and it's up to us to turn it all around. If you made it through this entire video, thank you for your support. Please like and share if you liked it. All credit for this one is due to the Holy Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who recognized all these ideas decades ago. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.